On December 19th, 1776, George Washington had 6 days left. Not 6 days to win the war, 6 days before his army stopped existing. Most of the men under his command, what remained of them, fewer than 3,000 out of the roughly 20,000 he had commanded in August, had enlistments that expired at midnight on December 31st. No bonus, no draft, no system existed to replace them. When the calendar turned, they were free to walk home, and most of them intended to. Washington had lost every major engagement since August. Long Island, Manhattan, Fort Washington, a retreat across New Jersey so thorough and so humiliating that British officers were openly betting on how many more weeks the rebellion had left in it. Congress had already fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, packing their official papers onto wagons in the kind of hurry that does not inspire confidence in the people watching them leave. Washington had 6 days, an army that did not want to be an army anymore, and almost nothing left to lose by gambling all of it on a single attack. So he planned one. Cross the Delaware River, in winter, at night, in boats never designed to carry this many men through this much ice, and strike a garrison of professional German soldiers 9 miles inland before dawn. If you want to understand how a starving, half-frozen, barely clothed force of roughly 2,400 men pulled that off against soldiers who had beaten them at every previous turn, and what it actually cost the men who did it, stay with me, because the part most people get wrong about this story is not the crossing. It's what happened in the hours before anyone got in a boat. That was December 19th, 1776. Here is how it began. In August of 1776, the Continental Army had looked like a real army for the first time in its short history. Roughly 20,000 men, organized, equipped as well as Congress could manage, dug into positions around New York City with the confidence of men who believed they could hold the largest port in British North America against whatever Britain sent at them. Britain sent everything. General William Howe arrived off Staten Island that summer with the largest expeditionary force the British Empire had ever assembled. More than 30,000 soldiers, hundreds of ships, a combined Army and Navy operation designed not merely to defeat Washington's force, but to end the rebellion in a single decisive campaign. The Battle of Long Island in August was a rout. Washington escaped only because Howe paused to consolidate rather than finish the job, and the army that retreated across the East River that night into Manhattan was already a smaller, more frightened version of what had marched out a week earlier. It got worse from there. Manhattan fell in September. Fort Washington, named with an irony nobody had the stomach to appreciate at the time, surrendered in November, costing Washington nearly 3,000 men captured in a single engagement, one of the worst losses of the entire war. The retreat across New Jersey that followed was not a fighting withdrawal. It was a collapse with discipline attached. Washington's army marched south through New Jersey in late November and early December, with British and Hessian forces in pursuit close enough, on at least one occasion, that American rear guards could see the enemy's advance units entering towns the Americans had just left. Loyalist sentiment surged across New Jersey as British control solidified. Men who had been neutral or quietly sympathetic to the revolution began declaring for the crown, calculating, reasonably, given what they were watching, that the war was already decided. By the time Washington crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania in early December, his force had shrunk to roughly 3,000 effective soldiers. Cold, sick, inadequately clothed for a winter campaign nobody had planned for, and watching the calendar count down toward December 31st, when most of their enlistments would simply expire and the Army would have no legal claim on their continued service. Congress had already fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. Thomas Paine, marching with the retreating army as a volunteer, was writing by firelight in those final weeks of December words that would become the American crisis, words that opened with a sentence Washington would soon order read aloud to every regiment he had left. "These are the times that try men's souls." The times were trying everyone, Washington most of all. He needed something, not territory, not a strategic position. He needed proof, for his own men, for Congress, for the colonists watching from their farmhouses, to decide which side was actually going to win this, that the war could still be won at all. He had 6 days to produce it. Colonel Johann Rall had every reason to be confident, and confidence had never once failed him before. He was a professional soldier in the truest sense of the word, a German mercenary, technically in the service of Hesse-Kassel rather than Britain directly, who had spent decades building a combat record across multiple European wars before Britain's money brought him and roughly 30,000 of his countrymen across the Atlantic to help suppress a colonial rebellion that by December of 1776 did not look like it required much suppressing. He had fought well that autumn. His regiment had performed competently at White Plains and at Fort Washington, and Howe had rewarded him with command of the garrison at Trenton, a forward post on the Delaware River, the kind of assignment given to an officer whose superiors trusted his judgment under pressure. Rall had spent months chasing Washington's disintegrating army across New Jersey, and had developed in that time a settled and not unreasonable contempt for the fighting capability of American militia. He had watched them break and run. He had watched their army shrink by the week. He did not consider the remnant huddled across the river in Pennsylvania a serious threat. In the days before Christmas, he received written warnings, more than one. Local loyalists and at least one of his own officers reported troop movements and suspicious activity on the Pennsylvania side of the river, raising the possibility that Washington might attempt something before his enlistments expired. Rall read the warnings, or was told of them, and dismissed the danger. He declined to fortify Trenton with the kind of earthworks that standard military practice would have called for in a forward position this exposed. He reportedly considered the comfort of his men over the Christmas holiday a higher priority than digging in against an enemy he did not believe capable of crossing an ice-choked river in a winter storm to attack a professional garrison. And no, this is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is what the record shows. On the night of December 24th, Rall attended a Christmas gathering in Trenton. Cards, drinking, the ordinary social rituals of an officer enjoying a holiday he had no reason to think would be interrupted. Accounts vary on exactly how late the evening ran and how much it affected his judgment the following morning, and the precise details of that night are genuinely disputed among historians. What is not disputed is what arrived in his hands at some point that evening or the next morning. a written note delivered by a local loyalist farmer warning explicitly of an American attack. Rall put the note in his pocket without reading it. He believed he understood exactly what kind of enemy he was facing. He was about to learn that the enemy he was facing was not the same one he had been chasing across New Jersey for the past 3 months. Washington's plan, on paper, required almost nothing to go wrong. 3 separate columns would cross the Delaware River at 3 different points on the night of December 25th, converge on Trenton from multiple directions before dawn, and overwhelm Rall's garrison while the town was still asleep. Washington's own force, the main column, roughly 2,400 men, would cross at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles upriver from Trenton, and march south through the night to strike at first light. A second column under General James Ewing would cross south of the town to block the Hessian retreat route across Assunpink Creek. A third column under Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south still and create a diversion to draw attention away from the main assault. 3 columns, 3 crossing points, 1 coordinated dawn attack against a garrison that did not know it was a target. It was an elegant plan, built on a piece of intelligence Washington trusted completely. Rall's contempt for American fighting ability and the holiday itself would leave Trenton exactly as undefended as the warnings suggested it might be. Washington had spies and informants feeding him details about Hessian dispositions for weeks. He knew the garrison's strength, roughly estimated. He knew Rall had not fortified the town. He was betting his entire remaining army on the accuracy of that picture. On the ground, almost everything went wrong before a single shot was fired. The crossing was scheduled to begin at sunset and conclude in time for the columns to reach Trenton well before dawn, while darkness still covered their approach. Instead, a brutal nor'easter rolled in as the operation began, sleet, then snow, then a freezing rain that coated men, horses, and equipment in ice almost as soon as the boats pushed off. The Delaware was running with ice floes thick enough to threaten the Durham boats, vessels designed to haul cargo on calm water, not to ferry thousands of men, horses, and artillery across a swollen winter river in the dark. The crossing at McConkey's Ferry took until nearly 3 in the morning to complete, hours behind schedule, the operation already bleeding the darkness it needed to remain undetected. Both the Ewing and Cadwalader columns failed to cross at all. The ice on the rivers south of Trenton was too thick, the conditions too dangerous, and both commanders called off their crossings entirely. Washington's main column was now alone. No diversion, no blocking force at Assunpink Creek to prevent a Hessian retreat. Just one frozen, exhausted force of roughly 2,400 men, hours behind schedule, with 9 miles still to march through a continuing storm before they could even reach the target they had crossed an ice-choked river to attack. He had built a plan with 3 moving parts. He now had 1. He decided to go anyway. The boats that carried Washington's men across the Delaware were Durham boats, long, narrow, flat-bottomed cargo vessels built to haul iron ore and pig iron down the river, not to ferry an army through ice in the dark. They worked, barely. Local watermen, mostly from a Marblehead regiment of Massachusetts fishermen and sailors who had experience handling boats in dangerous water, poled and rowed the heavy craft across a current thick with ice floes that ground against the hulls hard enough to be heard over the wind. Henry Knox, Washington's chief of artillery, weighed close to 300 pounds and had a voice that carried over a storm. He later wrote that the crossing was as severe a night as he had ever experienced, which, from a man who had served through most of the war's worst moments by that point, was not a small statement. Artillery was the hardest part. 18 cannon needed to cross alongside the infantry, and getting horses and gun carriages onto flat-bottomed boats in sleet, on a riverbank coated in ice, in full darkness, with men's hands too numb to properly grip rope or harness, turned what should have been a difficult logistical problem into something closer to a slow-motion catastrophe. Horses slipped, men slipped. The boats had to be loaded and poled across one at a time, and each crossing took longer than the one before it as the storm worsened and the river grew angrier. Washington crossed in one of the early boats and stood on the Pennsylvania side, then the New Jersey side, watching the operation unfold hour after hour as his schedule collapsed around him. He did not retreat to shelter. He stood in the same storm his men stood in, on the same exposed riverbank, watching boat after boat fight its way across. 2 soldiers froze to death before the army had even finished crossing. Not in battle. Standing in formation, waiting their turn, in a storm that did not distinguish between the men who would survive the coming battle and the ones who would not live to see it. The crossing that should have concluded by midnight did not finish until nearly 3 in the morning. Washington had lost 3 hours of darkness he needed and could not get back, and he had lost both of his supporting columns entirely. He stood on the New Jersey riverbank in the freezing dark, with roughly 2,400 exhausted, half-frozen men and 9 miles of road still between him and Trenton. He gave the army its password for the operation, spoken man to man down the freezing column in the hours before they marched. Victory or death. He meant it literally. There was no version of this plan that survived as anything other than one or the other. They began the march. The march to Trenton took nearly 4 hours through a storm that had not let up since the crossing began. Snow, sleet, and freezing rain came down on men who had already been awake and exposed to the cold for most of the night before they had even taken their first step on the New Jersey side. Some of the soldiers had no real shoes. Accounts from the campaign describe men marching with rags wrapped around their feet, leaving streaks of blood in the snow behind the column. The roads were barely roads. Frozen mud rutted hard enough to turn an ankle, and the column moved at the grinding pace of exhausted men trying not to fall. Washington split his force into 2 columns for the final approach, one under General Nathaniel Greene moving along the upper road into Trenton, one under General John Sullivan along the river road, timed to strike the town from 2 directions simultaneously. Sullivan sent word back partway through the march that the wet weather had soaked the muskets badly enough that he was not confident his men's powder would fire. Washington's response, relayed back down the line, was immediate. Use the bayonet. The town must be taken. They reached the outskirts of Trenton just after 8 in the morning, hours later than planned, but still achieving the one thing that mattered most: complete surprise. The Hessian garrison, roughly 1,500 men strong, was not formed up not alerted, not expecting an attack from an army that had spent the entire war up to this point being chased rather than chasing. The first contact came fast. American artillery, hauled across the river and through the storm at enormous cost, opened up on Trenton's main streets almost immediately, sweeping the roads with grape shot before Hessian soldiers could properly organize a defensive line. Soldiers spilling out of houses and barracks into the streets found themselves under fire from multiple directions at once, in a town with no fortifications to retreat behind, in conditions where visibility was cut to almost nothing by the continuing snow. Colonel Rahl, woken from sleep or roused from the aftermath of the previous night's gathering, depending on which account you trust, came out into the chaos, trying to rally his men into some kind of organized formation. He mounted his horse in the street and began shouting orders, trying to impose discipline on a garrison that had been caught completely unprepared in a fight that was already moving faster than his men could respond to it. He was shot from his horse within minutes, hit in the side, falling into the snow of a street he had refused to fortify because he did not believe this attack was possible. The battle that followed lasted under 2 hours. With Rahl down and bleeding in the street, the Hessian defense fell apart almost immediately. A group of his men tried to form up in an open orchard at the edge of town, the one piece of ground that offered any hope of regrouping into a real line. American artillery and advancing infantry closed off the escape routes before the formation could solidify. Without their commander, without fortifications, without dry powder in some cases, the Hessians had no way to turn the fight back in their favor. Within roughly 2 hours of the first shot, it was over. Approximately 22 Hessians killed, 90 wounded, and close to 900 captured, nearly the entire garrison taken in a single morning. American losses: 2 dead from exposure during the crossing, a small number wounded in the fighting itself. Rahl was carried into a nearby church, mortally wounded. He died the following day. In his coat pocket, soldiers found the note a loyalist farmer had handed him the night before, the written warning of the American attack, unopened. News of Trenton reached the rest of the colonies within days, and what it changed was not the war's geography. It changed its pulse. Without this single morning, the math facing Washington was brutal and exact. Most of his army's enlistments expired on December 31st. With no victory to point to, no proof the war could still be won, there was no reasonable argument for staying. The Continental Army would likely have dissolved into a few thousand scattered men by January, and Congress, already in Baltimore, already preparing for the possibility of total collapse, would have had no force left to negotiate from. If Trenton had failed, or never been attempted, there is a real possibility the revolution effectively ends in the first week of 1777, not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from an army that simply walked home. Instead, Washington had something to show his men on the morning of December 26th. 900 prisoners, captured cannon, and a defeated enemy who had spent months believing this army incapable of exactly what it had just done. He used it immediately. Standing before the same exhausted, half-frozen soldiers whose enlistments were set to expire within days, Washington personally appealed to them to stay another 6 weeks for an additional bonus, and enough of them agreed that the army held together through the winter. A week later, on January 3rd, Washington struck again at Princeton, outmaneuvering a British force and winning a second consecutive victory that confirmed Trenton had not been a fluke. The psychological effect rippled outward. Loyalist sentiment in New Jersey, which had been surging in November, reversed sharply. Recruitment for the Continental cause, which had been collapsing for months, picked back up. In Europe, observers who had been treating the American rebellion as a dying cause took note that Washington's army had crossed an ice-choked river in a winter storm and destroyed a professional garrison in under 2 hours. France, watching closely and weighing whether American independence was a serious bet or a lost one, found in Trenton one more piece of evidence that this war was not yet decided. Thomas Paine's words, written by firelight in the days before the crossing, read aloud to the very regiments that boarded those Durham boats, became permanently fused to the moment. "These are the times that try men's souls" was no longer just a sentence in a pamphlet. It was something men had heard hours before, risking their lives to prove it true. Trenton did not win the war. It kept the war alive long enough to be won later by other battles in other winters. That distinction is the entire point. The old Barracks Museum still stands in Trenton, New Jersey, on the same ground where Hessian soldiers were garrisoned that Christmas. It is one of the few surviving original buildings from the battle, a long stone structure built decades earlier to house British troops, now preserved as a museum with period rooms and artifacts from the campaign. A short walk away, on the spot where Colonel Rahl reportedly fell, a small monument marks the location. Trenton today is a working state capital, dense with government buildings and traffic, and the battlefield itself is mostly buried under 2 centuries of city. You have to know exactly where to look. The Delaware Crossing site, by contrast, has been preserved almost as open ground. Washington Crossing Historic Park sits on both the Pennsylvania and New Jersey sides of the river, with walking paths along the bank where the Durham boats once launched into the ice. Replica boats are rowed across the river every Christmas Day in a reenactment that has continued, with occasional interruptions, since the 1850s. Visitors stand on the same bank where 2 soldiers froze to death, waiting their turn, in weather that on a bad December afternoon can still feel uncomfortably close to what the record describes. George Washington went on to win the war, become the first president of the United States, and live until 1799, certain in his final years that the country he had nearly lost on a Delaware riverbank had become something durable. Colonel Johann Rahl is buried in Trenton, in a grave that draws far fewer visitors than the museum a few blocks away. The note he never opened is, in its own way, the most honest artifact this story produced. Proof that he had the information that might have saved his garrison and chose, for reasons that died with him, not to read it. Some of the most important nights in history turn on nothing more dramatic than a man too confident to open an envelope. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment. Do you think Rahl's death absolves him? Or does dying with that note still in his pocket make the failure worse? The comments on that question always split hard, and I read every one of them.